What challenges did the Carters face when growing cotton as their main cash crop during the Depression? And what were the many other crops raised by the Carters that contributed to a successful farm and guarded against the volatility of cotton prices? What livestock did the Carters raise? And what were the health and hygiene challenges that faced both farm workers and livestock? We can learn from these health tips today. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. Jimmy Carter's father was more prosperous than most farmers because he diversified as much as he could, always trying new crops, raising many varieties of livestock, packaging drinks to sell in nearby stores, and learning how to maintain his farm equipment in his small blacksmith shop, in addition to running a small store on his property. Mechanization of agriculture was limited in the years before World War II. Farmers plowed the fields with mules and horses. Cotton was the main cash crop in rural Georgia, although often bumper crops meant depressed prices. Cotton production shifted to the western states that had fewer problems with the boll weevil pests, leading Georgia farmers and plains to increasingly rely on raising peanuts, especially since the innovations of the black scientist George Washington Carver led to the invention of peanut butter and other uses for peanuts and sweet potatoes. Jimmy Carter remembers how picking cotton was back-breaking labor during the hottest time of the year. We moved slowly up and down the rows from when the heavy dew evaporated until sundown, bent over so we could reach the bottoms for the stalks, our fingers probing between the sharp burrs to pick each dangling lock of white seed cotton and cram it into long sacks that dragged behind us on the ground, suspended by straps that cut into our shoulders. So obviously the Carter children assisted in picking cotton. Throughout the South, a century of concentration on cotton production depleted soil nutrients. Much of the topsoil was lost to wind and rain, often leaving bare subsoil and fields scarred by ever-deepening gullies. Most landowners had little, if any, money for improvements or adequate fertilizer, and many were just looking for a way out. When Earl Carter purchased such a tired farm, he would apply his knowledge of crop rotation by first thoroughly plowing the tired land, and then planting in vetch and clover to bring life back to the soil. They would repair the house, barn, and fences, and after working the land with tenant farmers or day laborers, he would sell a farm for a good profit. The Carters also raised corn, a major staple crop, as they often ate grits, cornbread, or corn on the cob. The corn cobs and fodder were fed to the livestock. They also grew sweet potato, okras, peas, and greens, including collards, turnips, and cabbage. In the early summer, they harvested wheat, rye, and oats. They raised milk cows, beef cattle, and brood sows, as well as growing the hay and fodder to feed them. Most of the several dozen draft animals were mules. They also kept half a dozen mares for field work and riding, and to mate their jackass to produce mule colts. A few of their mules were leased out to their poor tenant families. The Carter children milked their dozen cows twice a day and churned the milk to produce buttermilk and cream. They would sell some of the milk and flavored drinks that they bottled for nearby stores, feeding what was returned and not consumed to the hogs and calves. They had a yard full of chickens, plus geese, turkeys, and even some peacocks. Every year his father would order several hundred chicks from Sears or another supplier to raise for dinner or for resale. Throughout the year, Jimmy also picked plums, blackberries, cherries, blueberries, and then figs, apples, and peaches, and then chestnuts, walnuts, pecans, and other nuts and berries. During the first cold days of winter, the Carters would usually slaughter about 20 of their hogs, cutting up the carcasses into various cuts of meat and making sausages from the internal organs and intestines. Since there was no refrigeration, they gorged on pork for a few days. They cured and preserved much of the meat in their smokehouse, which took several days using special wood, including oak, hickory, and sassafras. And many of the paintings we're using as illustrations were painted by WPA artists, who were unemployed painters hired by the government during the Depression to paint murals on the walls of the post offices and other government offices. Jimmy and his father also enjoyed hunting and fishing on their farm in adjacent woods. Many landowners didn't want their sharecroppers competing with them for the game on their property, but Earl Carter was fairer. Jimmy remembers, "My daddy only reserved the bobwhite quail and mourning doves for himself, leaving rabbits and squirrels to be hunted by those who lived or worked on our land. Almost universally permitted for tenants was the use of hounds at nights to find raccoons and possums. Jimmy Carter remembers, the time for fishing on the other boys on the farm was when it was too wet to work in the fields and when the creek levels were rising. We would often camp out overnight on the stream bank and fish in the increasingly muddy water for catfish and eels, looking out for water moccasins. In their blacksmith and carpenter shop, they repaired and welded their farm equipment, manufactured simple implements, and shod the shoes of their horses and mules. Jimmy Carter learned how to build furniture, a hobby he continued in his retirement. Earl Carter even learned how to replace soles and heels on shoes. Life was hard for all farmers in rural Georgia, both black and white. Everyone in the Carter family encouraged their bright young Jimmy Carter to attend college, and then the Annapolis Naval Academy, and then to join the Navy. His young wife Rosalind was quite disappointed when he resigned his commission to run the family farm after his father passed away. And we previously reflected on how Jimmy Carter described this transition from plowing with mules to commanding a nuclear submarine in his autobiography he wrote at 90, and in the stories we heard in our guided tour of his presidential library. And most of these stories we didn't repeat in this reflection. Now, although blacks and whites experienced health and hygiene challenges during the Depression, poor health was more prevalent among the black laborers and sharecroppers. Jimmy Carter remembers, the life expectancy of black men and women was less than 50 years. Most of the year they only ate 2 meals a day, usually cornmeal, fatback, molasses, and perhaps sweet potatoes. The more industrious families also had small gardens that provided some seasonal corn, Irish potatoes, collards, turnips, and cabbage, with a few rows of peas and beans planted alongside the garden fence. The combination of constant and heavy work, inadequate diet, and excessive use of tobacco was devastating to the health of our poorer neighbors. His mother encouraged her black neighbors to grow vegetables in their own gardens, and shared with them the vegetables from the Carter family garden. And some of the health problems faced by farm workers in the Depression era have been lessened, but likely those who work outside on farms will always face more health risks than those who work mostly indoors in the cities. One common danger to both man and beast was sunstroke and heat stroke, which could be deadly. When plowing in the southern heat, mules usually had enough sense to refuse to continue working when they were pushed to the limits of their endurance, becoming overheated. But horses were more likely to work themselves to death. They called sunstroke the bear. Jimmy Carter remembers, if someone quit sweating, his body temperature could almost immediately jump up 5 or 6 degrees, and death was a real threat. We knew to put such a man in the shade, pour our drinking water on his body, and rub his arms and legs. He would be taken to the doctor, who would recommend that they rest for a week with no hard work in the fields. Heat exhaustion was also a serious concern, but the symptoms of dizziness and nausea gave a few minutes advance warning before you reached a critical stage. And cramps were another affliction which could be prevented by hydration and salt intake. Jimmy Carter recalls, my father was quite familiar with animal husbandry, and I learned from him how to treat problems like scours, mastitis, a calf reluctant to be born, and the dreaded screwworms. He rarely needed the services of a veterinarian, but when he did, he usually employed their Uncle Jack Slappy. And one of the most terrifying health risks was rabies. Everyone was strict about inoculating farm dogs against rabies, and all dogs were expected to have an inoculation tag attached to their dog collar. One horror story that was told to young Jimmy was about a farmer bitten by a rabid dog. While the farmer still had control of his senses, he secured himself to a tree with strong chains and a lock, and then threw away the key so that in the final stages of his derangement and convulsions he wouldn't attack his wife and children. And he remembered, during my childhood I saw several mad dogs. If one of our dogs began to act strangely, we would tie it securely or lock it in a crib, and then shoot it unless it resumed its normal ways. And when you were bitten by a dog, which was common, they would cut off the dog's head and send it to the state lab for examination. If the dead dog was found to have been rabid, or if the dog couldn't be found, the victim would undergo a regimen of nearly 24 shots, which would hopefully avoid an inevitable death. Farmers also had to worry about poisonous snake bites. The Carters had a pool dug on their farm so the children could swim, but they always had to be careful lest they be bitten by a venomous water moccasin that could grow to a frightful size. And water moccasins were also a danger in the creeks they fished in. Once his cousin Hugh jumped into the pool with a water moccasin, but he scrambled out so fast that he didn't even get his clothes wet. Bare feet also caused health challenges. Jimmy Carter often went barefoot from March to October, as did many of the men who worked the farms. This meant that you had to be careful not to step on nails or rusty wires, as you could come down with tetanus. And you had to be careful not to slide your feet on wooden floors, lest you get splinters. Farm workers had to watch out for ringworms, stubbed toes, wasp and bee stings, and ticks. When Jimmy Carter visited the Clarks or other black families, he was often bitten by bed bugs hiding in mattresses or pallets in their homes. This is a problem with all farm families, but Mama, as a nurse, seemed obsessed with keeping our place free of these pests. We put the legs of our beds in saucers of kerosene, and we carried our mattresses outside regularly to be beaten and sunned on both sides. We scoured our house floors at least twice a year with a mixture of Octagon soap and the caustic Red Devil lye to make sure the cracks between the boards didn't harbor insect eggs. The Carter family dumped their chamber pots in the outhouses they constructed, but many black and white families squatted in the bushes to relieve themselves. And this primitive sanitation and walking barefoot led to widespread infections of hookworm in the American South. And there's a lecture on Wondrium, which is now the Great Courses Plus, which discusses the scourge of the South, hookworm, how it was discovered, and the public health campaign that controlled it. Jimmy Carter remembered almost everyone was afflicted from time to time with hookworm, which we call ground itch. Dr. Stiles, who discovered the hookworm parasite in the early 20th century, realized that 3/4 of Southerners suffered from hookworms, which caused chronic anemia. Jimmy Carter remembered, Mama always put medicine between my toes, which prevented the parasites from migrating over time into my lungs and then my throat, from there into my small intestines. Untreated, the millions of tiny worms consumed a major portion of scarce nutrients within the bodies of our poorest neighbors. And our main reflection on Jimmy Carter's book, An Hour Before Daylight, includes Jimmy Carter's recollection of how sharecropping worked in rural Georgia, unintended consequences of the New Deal, his memories of the hobos who came to their door during the Depression, and how the civil rights struggle affected his black neighbors in Plains and Archer, Georgia. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. If you're interested in learning what it was like to live on a farm in rural Georgia during the Depression, and how life was difficult for both the destitute black sharecropper and the landowning white farmer, then I would recommend Jimmy Carter's book, An Hour Before Daylight, Memories of a Rural Boyhood. This book will transport you to a different time and place. Long gone are the days when farmers plowed fields with horses and mules. Today, farming is big business. When Jimmy Carter returned to his farm after his presidency, he planted the least productive acreage and pine trees, and likely rented the more profitable farmland to large farmers who plow and harvest in air-conditioned combines. We tried not to repeat too many of the stories Jimmy Carter told us in his autobiography he wrote when he was 90, or in his daily devotions, or that we heard from our guided tour of his presidential library, so we encourage you to listen to these videos as well. There are also vignettes of what Christmas and life was like in rural Plains, Georgia, both during the Depression and the years after his presidency. And we decided to make this a separate video because of the charming story of Jimmy Carter's favorite Christmas after he left the presidency. And Jimmy Carter also wrote a book on the virtues of aging and retirement. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.